The planet Arda IV hung in a shroud of ash and fire, its surface scarred by months of relentless bombardment. The human colony was the last line of defense, a crumbling bastion against the Ikarin Swarm's march toward Earth's inner territories. Captain Elias Greaves crouched behind the rusted remains of an agricultural drone, the faint hum of his squad's comms buzzing in his ear. Clear on the left came Sergeant Mara Kane's voice, sharp and steady. Greaves glanced to his right, where Private Liam Harker held his rifle in trembling hands, his young face pale under the visor of his helmet. "Keep it steady, Harker," Greaves muttered, scanning the horizon through the cracked visor of his helmet. The valley ahead stretched out like a wound in the earth, bathed in an eerie green glow from the swarm's energy cannon. The cannon sat nestled within the valley, its pulsing core visible even at a distance. It was a grotesque alien structure, pulsating as though alive, surrounded by legions of chittering Ikarins. The Ikarins were a nightmare given form, chitinous, insect-like creatures with razor-sharp limbs and unblinking black eyes. They moved in unison, a hive mind with no individuality or hesitation, their very existence an affront to everything humanity stood for. The cannon had already destroyed 3 major colonies, and now its sights were set on the inner worlds. "Captain, we don't have the firepower for this," Kane whispered as she adjusted the malfunctioning autocannon strapped to her back. The weapon was a relic from a war fought generations ago, a machine capable of unleashing 3,000 rounds per minute but prone to overheating and jamming. It was humanity's last, desperate hope in a war where every other piece of technology had failed. Greaves gritted his teeth, his mind racing. "We don't need to destroy the whole cannon, just the core. That'll destabilize the entire structure." Corporal Dax Rivers, the squad sniper, chimed in, his tone light despite the tension. "Great plan, Cap. Any chance the Ikarins will just let us stroll in there and plant a bomb?" Greaves shot him a glare but couldn't suppress a grim smile. "That's where you come in, Rivers. Keep their heads down while we get close." The plan was madness, and they all knew it. A malfunctioning autocannon, a skeleton crew, and a suicide mission to destroy a weapon that had obliterated entire fleets. But madness was all they had left. "Captain," Harker said, his voice shaking, "do you think we can actually pull this off?" Greaves placed a firm hand on the young soldier's shoulder. "It's not about whether we can. It's about making sure they don't get past us. If we fail here, Earth is next. Remember that." The squad fell silent, their gazes fixed on the valley ahead. The laughter and camaraderie that had once been their shield against the horrors of war had faded, replaced by a grim determination. At 3,000 rounds per minute, the laughing had stopped. But the fight was far from over. Kane worked on the autocannon with meticulous precision, her hands steady despite the tension crackling in the air. The squad had huddled in a narrow gorge just outside the valley, the alien cannon's ominous glow casting long shadows over their position. Greaves crouched nearby, his eyes scanning the terrain as he outlined the plan one last time. "The autocannon overload should create a chain reaction in the energy core," he said, his voice low but firm. "We'll have less than 5 minutes to get out once it goes critical. Kane, can you make it work?" She didn't look up, her fingers dancing over the wires and circuits of the ancient weapon. "It'll work," she said, more to herself than to him. "Just hope we don't need a second try because we won't get one." Rivers leaned back against the rocky wall, his sniper rifle balanced on his knee. "No pressure, right? Just the survival of the human race riding on this." "Cut the chatter," Greaves snapped, though there was no real heat in his tone. The squad needed the levity, even if it was gallows humor. Harker was silent, gripping his rifle tightly as he stared into the distance. His youthful face was drawn, and the trembling in his hands hadn't stopped. Greaves moved closer, lowering his voice so the others wouldn't hear. "Harker, you good?" The young soldier nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yes, sir. Just trying to focus." "Good. Focus on one thing. Keeping us alive. That's your job. Nothing else matters." Harker exhaled shakily and gave a weak nod. Greaves patted his shoulder before stepping away. Kane finished her work and stood, wiping sweat from her brow. It's ready. But once we set it, there's no turning back. The autocannon's going to melt itself down. I hope you're all attached to your limbs because we'll need to run like hell. Greaves nodded. We'll move under cover of River's fire. Kane, you stick close to me. Harker, stay sharp and watch our six. The squad moved out, their movements calculated and silent. Rivers positioned himself on a rocky outcrop, his sniper rifle trained on the swarm sentries. Through his scope, he tracked the alien guards, towering creatures with sleek black armor and serrated limbs, their movements unervingly synchronized. Got 3 on the left, Rivers whispered over comms. Another 2 near the core. Easy pickings. Make it fast, Greaves replied. The first shot was almost poetic in its precision, a sentry crumpling without a sound. Then another and another. The aliens were falling, but not fast enough to escape notice. An alarm sounded, a piercing, chittering wail that echoed through the valley. Move now, Greaves barked. Kane hauled the autocannon into position as the squad sprinted toward the core. Rivers continued firing, buying them precious seconds. Greaves could hear the clicking of alien limbs behind them, the swarm closing in. They had seconds to set the charge, and every one of them counted. The core loomed before them, a pulsating sphere of energy encased in a lattice of alien metal. It gave off a low, ominous hum, like a living heartbeat. Greaves gestured for Kane to set the autocannon while the others formed a defensive perimeter. The chittering sounds of the swarm grew louder, echoing off the valley walls as the first wave of alien soldiers charged into view. Contact! Rivers shouted, his rifle firing in rapid succession. The crack of his shots echoed in the narrow space, each one dropping an Ikarin before it could get too close. Kane knelt by the core, sweat dripping down her face, as she attached the overloaded autocannon to the alien structure. Sparks flew as she worked, the interface between human and alien technology fighting her every step. I need 2 minutes, she yelled, her voice strained. You've got 1, Greaves replied, stepping forward to fire at the approaching swarm. His rifle barked in sharp bursts, but for every alien he dropped, 3 more seemed to take its place. The swarm moved like a tide, relentless and unyielding. Harker was on the edge of the perimeter, his rifle trembling in his hands as the creatures closed in. One broke through, its serrated limbs flashing in the dim light. The young soldier froze, his finger hovering over the trigger as terror gripped him. Harker! Fire! Greaves roared, spinning to take aim, but the alien was too close. The shot came from Harker's rifle, a single round piercing the creature's carapace. It collapsed at his feet, ichor spilling from the wound. Harker stood there, breathing heavily, his wide eyes locked on the fallen enemy. Good shot, Private, Greaves said, his tone calm despite the chaos. Now keep firing. Kane cursed under her breath, her tools clattering as she worked faster. The autocannon began to whine, its systems reaching critical overload. It's done, she shouted. We've got 3 minutes before this thing goes off. Fall back, Greaves ordered, motioning for the squad to retreat. Rivers provided cover fire, his rifle taking down aliens with mechanical efficiency as the team pulled back toward their exit route. But the swarm was relentless. They poured into the valley, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm the squad. One alien leapt toward Kane, its claws inches from her throat before Greaves tackled it midair. The 2 tumbled to the ground, and Greaves fired point-blank into its chest, the recoil jolting through his arm. Go, he shouted, shoving Kane toward the others. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes locking with his, but the urgency in his voice left no room for argument. The squad ran, the countdown ticking in their heads. Greaves stayed behind, firing into the advancing swarm, his rifle spitting fire until the magazine ran dry. He drew his sidearm, buying every second he could. The core's hum grew deafening, the autocannon's overload reaching its peak. Greaves spared a final glance toward the retreating figures of his squad before the valley was consumed in a blinding explosion. The ground shook beneath their feet as the explosion ripped through the valley, a searing wave of heat and light erupting behind them. The swarm's alien structures collapsed in a cascade of debris, the energy cannon's core detonating in a violent surge that consumed everything in its radius. Rivers was the first to stop, turning back to watch the inferno with wide eyes. Did he make it? Harker asked, his voice barely audible over the fading roar of the blast. Kane grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. "Don't stop. Keep moving," she yelled. Her voice cracked, but she didn't slow, her focus solely on getting the squad to safety. The group didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the valley, collapsing behind a cluster of boulders as the aftershocks of the explosion rumbled through the ground. Kane doubled over, gasping for air, while Harker fell to his knees, his rifle slipping from his grasp. Rivers slumped against a rock, his usual smirk absent as he stared at the glowing remains of the valley. Greaves was gone. Silence hung over them, broken only by the distant crackle of fire. Harker finally spoke, his voice trembling. He stayed behind. He knew he wouldn't make it. Kane looked up, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "He gave us the chance to finish this. That's all that mattered to him." Rivers shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the destruction. "Crazy bastard actually pulled it off. Took the whole damn cannon with him." The loss was heavy, but the significance of what they'd achieved began to sink in. The swarm had lost their most powerful weapon, a blow that humanity desperately needed. For the first time in months, there was hope. Kane reached into her pack and pulled out a small, battered piece of metal Greaves dog tags. She held them tightly, her knuckles white as she looked at the others. "We don't let this be for nothing," she said, her voice firm despite the emotion threatening to break through. "We carry this fight forward. For him. For everyone we've lost." Harker nodded, his expression hardening. The fear that had gripped him earlier was gone, replaced by something colder, more resolute. "I won't let them win. Not after this." Rivers let out a long breath, his smirk returning faintly. "Guess we've got a reputation to live up to now." Greaves set the bar pretty damn high. Kane smiled faintly, her grip on the tags loosening as she slid them back into her pack. "He believed in us. That's enough." As they began the long trek back to the human encampment, the remnants of the explosion still smoldering behind them, a broadcast crackled to life on their comms. Reports were already spreading across the colonies. The cannon was destroyed, the swarm was retreating, and Captain Elias Greaves' name was on every frequency. Humanity had bought itself time, and the fight was far from over. But in that moment, as the squad walked together under the scorched sky, they knew they'd made a difference. They carried the weight of their losses, but also the spark of hope that had been reignited. At 3,000 rounds per minute, the laughing had stopped, but the legacy of their fight would echo across the stars.